Hi, my name is Daniel Notkin, and welcome to the wonderful world of oysters. And today we've got a great spread in front of us. We've got two different kinds of oysters. We've got an East Coast oyster and a West Coast oyster. And it's vital that we see the difference between the two, because these two over here are the East Coasters, and these here are the West Coasters. And you'll see a big difference between these. First, we have the oyster on the East Coast. It's rounded shell. It's got a nice sort of evenly deep cup. And then we move over to a little West Coast oyster. That's a Kumamoto. And they are a very specific oyster. Some think they're their own species even. And you'll see the fluted ridge on the side here and also the fluted ridge on the bottom. And that's one easy way to tell a West Coast oyster versus an East Coast oyster. And they are different species, so the flavor is going to be massively different. The East Coast oyster is going to have flavors of salt water, of seaweed, fresh salt water and seaweed. And these over here are going to start off with a lot of seaweed, hints of melon in the middle, and then a little bit of cucumber at the end. They're going to be a little bit more creamy, and they also differ in what times of year they're available. Now, a worker is only as good as his tools, and opening an oyster is very important because you got to have the right tool. This is Richard's. It's a standard knife you can get at a lot of fish shops. It's great. It's okay for opening a knife for first-timers. Just go gentle, get used to it, get used to each knife you handle. The other ones you can have are shaped a little bit differently. This here's a Dexter Russell. It's a little bit of a higher-end knife. It's a stainless steel. It's a plastic grip. This doesn't stain, doesn't wear out as much, and also the cut of the blade is a little bit different. This here is a knife that I made myself, and it has basically the shape of a knife that I enjoy using. A sharp tip to get right into the oyster, honed just slightly at the sides with a not too sharp an edge, because if it's too sharp, it's going to dull. And so this is going to open an oyster. What you basically want to do is you don't want to cut through the oyster. You want to scrape it away. So get used to your knife. Go slowly. Don't hurt yourself. You've got a long life ahead of you. All right, and now we're ready for some of the stuff that goes great with oysters. So what we have is some great fresh horseradish. Remember, horseradish is a root, and its defense mechanism is released once you start grating it. So once you start grating it more and more, that's when all the heat's going to come out. Then we have some lime over here. When you're serving lime with oysters, and even lemons, cut off the ends so you got something to squeeze with. Then, one of my favorite condiments is a classic mignonette that's from France. They do it with red wine vinegar and shallots. And basically, I change it up a little bit. I love my oysters with a little bit of champagne vinegar and shallots. And now we're ready for some shucking. All right, so now to the shucking. Basically, there's a few important things to remember when shucking an oyster. Number one is that food tastes best when it's the proper texture. And the proper texture is, for tasting an oyster, exactly as it's laid out in the shell. You don't want it to taste like scrambled eggs. You want it to taste like an oyster. And for that, there's three important components. Number one is knowing exactly how the oyster is laid out so you can open it properly. The oyster has a muscle that holds it shut, right on top here and right in the bottom there. That's vital because that's what's holding that oyster closed. We're going to open that up, and that's just going to let the lid pop right off. The second is the belly and back here. Ideally, you don't ever want to cut into the belly, but that's another issue altogether. You're going to master that after about 10,000 oysters. So when you want to open the oyster, the important part is you start at the hinge. You can insert the knife at a 45-degree angle. You see how it just holds there? That's exactly the amount of forces you just want to start off with. Once you find that little sweet spot, then you can dig a little deeper. You're going to use a little bit of force, just as much force as you use to sharpen a pencil. That's it. Then you're going to turn the knife with, imagine like you're revving a motorcycle and you hear that little pop. That means you've just cracked the shell open. Now, once you have it like this, the notion is to cut that top muscle and it'll just fall right off. So you insert the knife right to the top of the oyster, and you just scrape across. And as you're scraping across, you're going to cut that muscle. And cutting that muscle is just going to let the top of the shell fall right open, and there's your oyster. Almost exactly as it was sitting in the shell. The muscle is right there. The belly's right there. You leave it untouched. Then what you're going to do is you're going to turn that around, because you're going to want to cut the bottom of the oyster off too. Otherwise, it's a little more difficult to get off the shell. Cut it off the bottom of the shell, and then you have the oyster all laid out. The mantle in front, the belly in back, the muscle perfectly there, and that texture on your tongue is just going to be perfect. Another important thing is get to know your oyster. There are different kinds of oysters, and each oyster has their characteristic. The East Coast ones are going to be a little bit more sturdy. But some oysters, like the West Coast oysters, are a little more fragile. And the more pressure you put into them, the more the knife is going to slide right through them. So just be gentle, go with the oyster, get to know it, and the more you do oysters, the more you're going to get to see them. All right, and now for the best part about oysters, and oddly enough, the part that takes least time is that's eating them. So there's a few different ways to have oysters. I'm a bit of a purist. I believe that each oyster is just amazingly beautiful on its own. M.K. Fisher once wrote in her book, eating an oyster is like kissing the ocean. So I love tasting at least one straight. Each oyster has a different flavor, and also that flavor is going to change from week to week because they're taken out of the water each week. So one way, the most important thing when you start off eating an oyster is, if you're able to, give a little smell. If you've got a good shucker that you trust, he's already going to do that. He's already going to take care of it. And smell alone, you're going to taste it. Before you put stuff on, give it a little smell. There's nothing worse than losing your life passion for oysters over one bad oyster. So have one straight to just see what she's like. That's a pretty good oyster. Chew it up. A lot of people believe you just swallow an oyster. If you swallow an oyster, you're not getting any of the beauty of it. It's like swallowing a Chateauneuf du Pape. What's the point? Take it, savor it. The longer you have something in your mouth, the more those flavors are going to come out. All right. The other great way to have an oyster is, like I said, with a little bit of that mignonette. And a mignonette, like I said, is the shallots and champagne vinegar, just enough to give it just a little bit of character, a little bit of crunch. Try that one. Wow, that's good. That effervescence, that onioniness, just going to complement seafood like lobster, like scallops, anything you have. The third great way to have it is a little bit of Tabasco, a little bit of fresh prepared horseradish, a little bit of lemon. Squirt that on. As you have in your mouth, take a little breath. All that sea air is going to come right over your tongue as you chew up that oyster. You're going to get all the flavor. Absolutely fantastic. And there you go. And that's Oysters 101. You're welcome to try and experiment as much as you like. I'm Dan Notkin. Thanks very much. I'm going to have one of these.